Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 506. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Lanslone. Today we have co-host Connor Freeman returning. Connor, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing pretty good. Connor, it's a little bit different today. This might be a little bit more of an interview than our typical news show that we do. And that's because on Thanksgiving, something really cool happened. There was the Joe Rogan Experience. The guest was Dave Smith. And he mentioned several times your name in an article written by you and the boss at the Libertarian Institute, Scott Horton, about uh, I guess the rise of Hamas maybe and Israel, particularly Benjamin Netanyahu's hand in that. So we are going to be talking about that on today's show. And, Kyra's kind of just going to go over it. I might ask him a couple questions here or there if I think a point needs to be elaborated on, but this will be something a little bit different. Connor, just want to remind people that we are hosting our end of the year fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. So if people want to support my work, support your work, make sure that you and Scott could write more great articles like this, that Scott could put out his forthcoming book, Provoked. We're publishing books by Scott Horton, James Bovard, and Keith Knight in the coming months. We could continue to produce this show. I write news articles almost every day for the Libertarian Institute. So tons of great content can be supported by you just making a small donation to the Institute. So head on over to libertarianinstitute.org if you can and make a donation. If not, I get it, times are tough for a lot of people, but you can always help out the show just by hitting the share button, no matter where you're listening. Put it up on your favorite social media site and tell people to listen. And we always appreciate when you do that. All right, Connor, let's get into your article here. And I'm just going to kind of let you start off where you need to feel like you need to start off. Again, this is the article that Dave Smith discussed on the Joe Rogan Experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So we published this, Scott and I wrote this, and then we published it before the end of last month. So about 20 days after the initial Hamas attack on southern Israel, where Hamas broke out of the Gaza prison camp, or however you'd like to characterize it, open air prison, concentration camp, what have you. It's been besieged since 2007 under an air, land, and sea blockade. And in this unprecedented fashion, Hamas launched an attack onto southern Israel, attacking military bases and some kibbutzim in the south by air, land, and sea. They launched thousands of rockets, or at least that's what was initially reported. The name of the operation was Al-Aqsa Flood, and this, of course, Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is the third holiest site in all of Islam, and the Palestinians when they're there, especially during the month of Ramadan and really throughout the year, are often attacked by Israeli forces, and that the site is desecrated very often by Israeli settlers. And so that's one of the reasons why this was called Al-Aqsa Flood. That was happening very often in the lead up to the attack itself. And so in the attack, about 1,000 people or 1,200 people were killed, and we're now finding out that a not insignificant number of those people were killed actually by Israeli forces in crossfire or just being shelled in homes, along with the Hamas militants that were holding these people hostage. And of course, there was these prisoners who were hostages who were taken from Israel to Gaza, and they were going to be used as bargaining chips to negotiate prisoner releases, because the Israeli forces, the apartheid state of Israel, has locked up thousands of Palestinians, or essentially political prisoners.
Probably worth mentioning too, Connor, that over 300 of the people who died in Israel on October 7th were Israeli soldiers of some
Yes.
kind. And so, again, not that just because you're wearing some uniform, it makes your life forfeit and anybody could kill you. However, if we're talking about a terrorist attack, those typically occur on civilian, not military targets. And so the fact that 300 soldiers were killed gives some indication that there were at least some of the targets were directed at soldiers, not just civilians there.
Oh yes, absolutely. It was a military operation, and you could also describe it as, other aspects of it were a terrorist attack meant to provoke a reaction by the Israeli forces, by Benjamin Netanyahu's extremist right wing government, and so, a lot of people here we're kind of left in the dark, especially in American media. It was framed as, history, just like 9/11, history starts on October 7th. Hamas is this horrible terrorist group that must be eradicated. There's not too much discussion of, is Gaza the country next door? What is this? What is this, a government even? Is this a state? But in the Israeli media, in Times of Israel and in Haaretz, there was an immediate just censuring of Benjamin Netanyahu by major columnists for his role in supporting Hamas for decades, and Likud's role in supporting Hamas for years and years, as a counterweight to the Palestinian Authority, which is the more moderate secular wing that controls parts of the West Bank. They're really as Scott has described them, trustees in an Israeli prison over there in the West Bank, but have been shown to be much more willing to negotiate with the Israelis, and there's much more. They have much more, let's say, legitimacy on the international stage, and have for decades, certainly than Hamas does. And so we get into the whole history here in the article of why the Likud party, the right-wing party that Benjamin Netanyahu leads, has used Hamas essentially as a way of precluding any negotiations over Palestinian territory, and certainly any Palestinian state, in order to continue stealing more land, building more settlements in the West Bank, and also continue waging their periodic wars on Gaza. Although right now, as we've discussed repeatedly, it looks like it's more of an ethnic cleansing campaign. But just to break down some of the history before we get into all this. In 1947 and 48, there's the Nakba, or catastrophe, where essentially Israeli terrorist groups ethnically cleanse about 750,000 Palestinians from their land into the West Bank, in Jordan and the Gaza Strip, and other neighboring countries around the area. And so after the Nakba and the 48 war, Israel controls about 78% of what is called historic Palestine. And Jordan, the Israelis made a secret deal with the king of Jordan, and so they took over control of the West Bank and the Palestinians who were living there, and Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. But in 1967, in the Six-Day War, which Israel started and won in its war with Syria, Egypt, and Jordan, they actually conquered and seized, among other territories, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. And they've controlled the Gaza Strip and the West Bank since uninterrupted for 56 years, longer than the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe. But in 1979, beginning with the the meetings at Camp David, we saw that there was the beginning of a so-called peace process where Israel was supposed to negotiate with the PLO, with these Palestinian factions, a process wherein the Palestinians would eventually get their own independent state and have some self-determination and equal rights within their own territory. And this Palestinian state would be in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. But of course, just to skip over a bit of the negotiations and the Oslo Accords, this was really never followed through on. The Israelis never ended their occupation, which is still illegal, of course, under international law. And they continued to build settlements to the point where now you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of illegal Israeli settlers, illegal Israeli settlers living in these Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which are essentially Jewish-only colonies. And it has eviscerated even the pretense of a Palestinian state. And in the meantime, we have this situation where Hamas is all, we always hear that they had won this election in 2006, and that the people of Gaza support Hamas, and therefore they're a hostile state, or that's how it's often framed in the media. And we can see that the Israelis here, as I'll get into, that's the image that they were looking for. And so it's a divide and conquer strategy to basically frame it as Hamas is this other group the Palestinians are basically split from the West Bank and Gaza. And so it eliminates the potential for there to be peace talks in to create this Palestinian state, because we are told that there's no way we can actually negotiate with Hamas there, and they're just they want to destroy Israel. And so we're going to break down the history of how this all happened and why this is exactly what Benjamin Netanyahu wanted and was counting on. And yet it seems to have backfired, of course, here on the 7th. And now we're in this horrible situation that we're in. But so we'll begin by discussing the history of the founding of Hamas. So this starts in after the 1967 war. And so basically Hamas is founded, I should say, in the 80s, but its precursors are developed by the Muslim Brotherhood in the early 20th century, and they exist in Egypt and in Gaza. But these after Israel takes Gaza in 1967, they relax these restrictions that the nationalist government of Egypt had imposed. And so they begin to cultivate these groups as a counterweight to the secular and nationalist Palestine Liberation Organization led by Yasser Arafat and his Fatah faction. And so this has been documented. I recommend people read Robert Sale in United Press International. We have all these links. Andrew Higgins in the Wall Street Journal, and Brian McClinchy from Stark Realities, who writes for us very often at the Libertarian Institute. Great writer, brilliant researcher. And of course, Adam Raz, the historian who has written about this extensively in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, for example. And so this is following the 67 war. We have the indefinite occupation is imposed, and this burgeoning Islamic movement begins growing. Now, before the war, such groups in Palestine were described as weak and dormant, and initially they served as charities, improving the lot of Palestinians living in these refugee camps in Gaza by establishing social services, including building educational and religious and cultural infrastructure. And while the Israeli regime is brutally cracking down on members of the PLO, Tel Aviv is, as I say, easing these restrictions on the Islamist groups that Cairo had previously imposed. So although the Israeli government is well aware of the true aims of this movement, this burgeoning movement, and its spiritual leader, Sheikh Ahed Yassin, who was a half-blind and disabled Muslim cleric, which included eventually liberating all of Palestine from Israel's illegal occupation and in its place instituting an Islamic State. They continued to do this because they thought it was strategically beneficial, because it would undercut the dominant opposition to the Israeli occupation by Fatah. So there's all kinds of reporting that goes back on this over the years. So, for instance, we have Avner Cohen, an Israeli official who was in charge of religious affairs in Gaza for over 20 years until 1994. And he revealed that the traditional Islamic clerics had warned him regarding Sheikh Yassin. He says, quote, "They said, keep away from Yassin. He is a big danger." They also told Cohen that the cleric has no formal Islamic training and is driven by politics, not faith. So he told the Wall Street Journal, "Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation." According to U.S. officials, U.S. intelligence officials speaking with Robert Sale at United Press International, they said funds for the movement came from the oil-producing states and directly and indirectly from Israel. So indeed, Israel's backing of Hamas and its predecessor, Yassin's Mujama al-Islama, or the Islamic Center, as a CIA official told Sale, this was a direct attempt to divide and dilute support for a strong and secular Palestine Liberation Organization by using these groups as competing religious alternatives. So, for instance, there was an Islamic university in Gaza built by Yassin, which Tel Aviv had endorsed around this time and was later deemed an extremist hotbed and then bombed in December of 2008 during Israel's 22-day war on Gaza. And this was Operation Cast Lead. We'll get more into some of these bombing campaigns in this century later on. But sticking with the 70s and the 80s, we have in 1981 in the New York Times, Brigadier General Yitzhak Sergev, who was Israel's military governor in Gaza during the early 80s, he's saying to the New York Times, but the Islamic fundamentalists the report says, but the fundamentalists are also receiving some aid, General Sergev said. Quote, "The Israeli government gives me a budget and the military government gives it to the mosques. Explained the general, who was a military attaché at the Israeli embassy in Tehran before the Islamic Revolution there. The funds are used for both mosques and religious schools with the purpose of strengthening a force that runs counter to the pro-PLO leftists. So Segev later clarifies to the Wall Street Journal several years later, in about 2009, that at the time he was under, quote, no illusions about Sheikh Yassin's long-term intentions or the perils of political Islam. And the journal report continues, but Yassin and Israel had a shared enemy, secular Palestinian activists. And he says, but the cleric at that time was still 100% peaceful towards Israel, whereas the PLO was employing violent resistance, including bombings and hijackings at this time still. So in the early 80s, the Islamist movement begins radicalizing. And this is as a result of Israel's wars and illegal invasions and occupations in southern Lebanon, for instance, which led to the rise of Hezbollah in 1982, as well as the overthrow of the Shah Reza Pahlavi, the CIA-installed dictator in Iran, and the subsequent founding of the Islamic Republic. So Yassin, there's a process of radicalization beginning to happen as they're inspired by these new, groups that are opposed to. Hezbollah is resisting the Israeli occupation, and of course, the Islamic Republic becomes is really leading sort of the resistance in the region to American imperialism by overthrowing their brutal military dictator. And so Yassin is arrested by Tel Aviv in about 1984 as sharp clashes are ongoing between Fatah and the Islamists. And so Israeli authorities who would normally step aside when fighting between the groups would break out, they received a tip from supporters of Fatah that the Islamists were collecting weapons. And so Israeli soldiers raided a mosque and found a cache of arms. But as David Hakam, an Arab affairs expert in the Israeli military who worked in Gaza in those days, told Andrew Higgins at the Wall Street Journal, Yassin explained to interrogators that his group meant to use those weapons against rival Palestinians, not Israel. So Yassin was released a year later and continued to grow his organization, which pretty soon thereafter, I should say, became a Hamas. But in a foreshadowing of what was to come, Cohen, I mentioned earlier, warned senior Israeli military as well as civilian authorities in occupied Gaza that he believed that by continuing to turn away our eyes, our lenient approach to Yassin's group will in the future harm us. He said, I therefore suggest focusing our efforts on finding ways to break up this monster before this reality jumps in our face. And so the relative peace between Yassin's movement and Israel would not last much longer after that. The group known today as Hamas, which means the Islamic Resistance Movement, was founded in 1987 and began to flourish during the First Intifada, the violent uprising against the Israeli occupation in Palestine. And this starts in 87 and lasts until 1993. Now, this is where it gets very interesting. So the PLO in 1988 agrees that they will recognize Israel in exchange for a Palestinian state. And they would recognize Israel within 1967 borders. And so we were supposed to see after 1993 with the Oslo Accords, we were supposed to, the negotiations were supposed to lead to the founding of a Palestinian state, or the establishment, I should say, of a Palestinian state, and an end to the occupation. Whereas Hamas refused to ever recognize for years. They do now, but I shouldn't say recognize Israel, but they're willing to, in exchange for, if there's an end to the occupation and a Palestinian state is allowed to be created, they would recognize the 67 borders. So it's the same, it's a distinction essentially without a difference. And so, but because even though Hamas refused to recognize Israel's right to exist for many years, and they continued increasing their violence and even began using suicide bombings, for instance, in 1994, and that the PLO had dropped the maximalist demand themselves, Israel's backing for Hamas continued apace. As a U.S. intelligence source explained to Richard Sale, this support was even directed toward, quote, members who were dangerous terrorists. And he says this is because a U.S. official then tells Sale that this is because the thinking on the part of some of the right-wing Israeli establishment was that Hamas and the other groups, if they gained control, they would refuse to have anything to do with the peace process, and they would torpedo any agreements put in place. So Hamas began its attacks on Israel in 1989, and this triggers a whole round of arrests of members of the group, including Sheikh Yassin. And although he was sentenced to life in prison, many of these suspected Hamas activists were deported to Lebanon, where they began to link up with Hezbollah. And then when they returned to Gaza to ramp up their attacks against the Israelis, Hamas also and Fatah, they were condemning the PLO as traitors for going to the negotiating table with Tel Aviv to work out a two-state solution. And so after Tel Aviv's failed attempt to assassinate one of the group's political leaders who was living in exile in Jordan, Yassin was then released from prison in exchange for these jailed Israeli agents. And so as Higgins notes in the Wall Street Journal, and there's such parallels here with America's wars. Just in this century, particularly in Afghanistan, when you look at what General Stanley McChrystal would call insurgent math. Higgins says, when it became clear in the 1990s that Gaza's Islamists had mutated from a religious group into a fighting force aimed at Israel, particularly after they turned to suicide bombings in 1994, Israel cracked down with ferocious force. But each military assault only increased Hamas's appeal to ordinary Palestinians. And then we'll get into how the group won a plurality in an election in 2006. But one of the reasons is because as the occupation became more violent and Hamas became more resistant to the Israeli forces, as you kill more civilians and kill more militants, you're going to create more support for groups that are willing to resist with arms. And that's what I'm referring to here with McChrystal's insurgent math. Whereas he says that if you kill, I believe it's if you have 10, if you kill 10 terrorists, you think you end up with 0, but you actually end up with, I might get it wrong. It's if you kill 2 terrorists, you end up with 10 or 20, because each of those guys have brothers and cousins and fathers and uncles, and they're going to seek revenge ultimately against the occupying force, the invading military force. And so we see a similar dynamic here. Because, with these mass murder campaigns, even when they're waged against those who are deemed to be terrorists or militants in the midst of a brutal occupation, you invariably water these armed groups like plants. And so this is one of the reasons for the infamously failed surge, for instance, in Obama's part of the war on Afghanistan. And so that's what I'm referring to here. And so and this point is made by Andrew Higgins later on about the war on Gaza's the previous wars on Gaza before clearly an ethnic cleansing campaign going on now. But in the smaller scale wars that happened in, say, 2009, for instance, Higgins wrote that most damage from the war, say many Palestinians, is Fatah, now Israel's principal negotiating partner. A longtime Fatah supporter named Baker Abu Baker told Higgins that, quote, everyone is praising the resistance and thinks that Fatah is not part of it. So it creates this conflict of interest, no pun intended, where the policy of supporting Hamas and also cracking down so hard on them at the same time, and increasing, building settlements and continuing to abuse the Palestinian people, it only creates really a rally around the flag effect, which only got worse once Israel imposed its siege on Gaza. And so that's what we'll get into now. So I'm going to go through here and grab some of the quotes here. So following the Second Intifada, when there was, Frank, 1,000 Israelis were killed and 4,500 Palestinians were killed. Ariel Sharon, who was a Likudnik and the prime minister of Israel at the time, initiated a policy known as disengagement. And so you'll often hear people say, well, the Israelis left Gaza in 2005. And they'll even say we ended the occupation. But that's just simply not true. And I'll get into why. But Israel maintained military control over the Gaza Strip and has ever since, really since 1967. And still, there's really no dispute under international law and human rights groups that the territory is still under occupation by the Israelis. But so they decided to remove thousands of settlers and occupying forces from the Gaza Strip. So the Israeli army is redeployed in these areas surrounding Gaza instead, And on the surface, this is made to look like a concession, but Likud's goal was decisively to kill the peace process and end even the prospect of negotiating a Palestinian state or a right of return for these refugees who've been kicked off their land in 1947 and 1948 forever. And so there was resistance to this from the Israeli right, especially as to, why are we even doing this? And so Sharon's senior advisor, Dov Weissglass, told Haaretz 2 decades ago, he explained that this puts the peace process in formaldehyde. And so here's one of the quotes. When people say that we left Gaza and look what Hamas has done, and we gave them their land back, we should never give up land for peace because it always ends up with more attacks from these Palestinians. It's just not true. So as Weissglass says, the significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process. When you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. You prevent a discussion on the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, the whole package called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed indefinitely from our agenda. And all this with a U.S. presidential blessing and the ratification of both houses of Congress. The disengagement is actually formaldehyde. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary, so there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. The disengagement plan makes it possible for Israel to park conveniently in an interim situation that distances us as far as possible from political pressure. It legitimizes our contention that there is no negotiating with the Palestinians. We have educated the world to understand that there is no one to talk to. And we received a no one to talk to certificate. The certificate says, 1, there is no one to talk to. 2, as long as there is no one to talk to, the geographic status quo remains intact. 3, the certificate will only be revoked when this and this happens, when Palestine becomes Finland. See you then, and shalom. And so in 2006, the George W. Bush administration is promoting what they call democracy around the world. As we saw how well that went in Iraq, they thought they'd try their hand in Gaza, in Palestine. And so Hamas is encouraged to run in these elections, and Fatah, of course, is also running in the elections. And Hamas actually achieves a plurality victory, although they don't win a majority in a single district. And of course, half of Gaza's population of 2.3 million people is children. So most of the people living in Gaza who are being bombed to bits by the Israeli apartheid army now are not. They had no hand in this. I mean, they never voted for Hamas, and no elections have been held since 2006 in Palestine. So it's simply a sort of a disingenuous argument. But it's critical to note that after a coalition government, and this is by then Mahmoud Abbas, who currently is the president of the Palestinian Authority, has taken over in the wake of Arafat's death. And so there are these parliamentary elections held. And even though Hamas wins this plurality victory, before there can be a coalition government instituted, George W. Bush and his neocons, namely Condoleezza Rice and Elliott Abrams, attempt a coup against Hamas by pouring arms into Fatah and basically having them go to war with Hamas to try and prevent them from taking power. But this backfires on the Americans and the Israelis because, well, I shouldn't say the Israelis, because I think actually this ultimately, Likud exploited this situation to the nth degree in order to maintain their chosen status quo really until October 7th. But as David Rose reported in Vanity Fair at the time in his great article, The Gaza Bombshell, this outlet has obtained confidential documents since corroborated by sources in the U.S. and Palestine, which lay bare a covert initiative approved by Bush and implemented by Rice and Abrams to provoke a Palestinian civil war. The plan was for forces led by Mohammed Dahlan, Fatah's longtime resident strongman in Gaza, and armed with new weapons supplied at America's behest to give Fatah the muscle it needed to remove the democratically elected Hamas-led government from power. But their secret plan backfired, resulting in a further setback for American foreign policy under Bush. Instead of driving its enemies out of power, the U.S.-backed Fatah fighters inadvertently provoked Hamas to seize total control of Gaza. So ever since then, as everybody knows pretty well now, especially, the Israelis have used Hamas's control of the Strip, which they caused, to justify imposing the blockade by air, land, and sea in 2007 and all of Israel's subsequent collective punishment policies against the Palestinians besieged in the Strip. So, as military intelligence director Amos Yadlin commented on June 13th, 2007, and this was revealed in the WikiLeaks, that, quote, Israel would be happy if Hamas took over Gaza because the IDF could then deal with Gaza as a hostile state. He also dismissed Iran's influence over Hamas, which is constantly trumpeted as well. He says, as long as they don't have a port, it's nothing Israel can't handle. So, ever since, as I say, the siege was imposed, there have been several wars on Gaza. And, it's really not fair to call them wars, since the Palestinians in Gaza, and Hamas, for that matter, have no army. They have no, I mean, they're a stateless militia, really. And they have no army. There's no air force. There's no air defenses. There's no navy to speak of. And so what these are massacres and canned hunts. Euphemistically and frankly cynically referred to as operations. And you have Operation Cast Lead in 2009, which kills over 1,000 people, including over 300 children. And you have Operation Protective Edge, which killed, it's well over 2,000 people, including more than 500 children. There was Operation Guardian of the Walls in 2021, which killed nearly 250 people, including 67 children, wounding 2,000 more. And throughout all of these wars, there's massive destruction of Palestinian civilian infrastructure. So, for instance, in Cast Lead, as the UN has documented, Israel destroyed 18 schools, 268 factories and warehouses, as well as 3,540 homes, which were entirely destroyed. There were another 2,870 housing units that were significantly damaged. 20,000 people were left homeless and displaced within Gaza after the war. For instance, the 51-day war in 2014, this is a report from Bet Salem. This is just an excerpt. This is after the 51-day war on Gaza, 18,000 residential units were either completely destroyed or heavily damaged, leaving more than 100,000 Palestinians, some 17,000 families homeless. The destruction was caused by, as they say, Israel's unlawful open fire policy, which includes the bombardment of civilians and civilian structures from the air, land, and sea. According to the military's own figures, as reported in the media, the scale of shelling during the operation was unprecedented. They fired 35,000 artillery shells of different types and 14,500 tank shells, not including the air raids. And they write here that artillery is known as a statistic weapon because it is intrinsically inaccurate and can land anywhere within a range of dozens of meters. Using artillery in a crowded urban environment inevitably causes destruction on a large scale. So in that war, in the 2014 war, 2,251 Palestinians were killed, including 1,462 civilians, according to the UN, 551 of which were children and 299 women. And left wounded were 11,231 Palestinians, including 3,436 children and 3,540 women, 10% of whom were injured so badly that they were left permanently disabled. And so, for instance, just to show how cynical this is, the Israelis called this massacre, this large-scale bombing campaign, Operation Protective Edge. And we have to remember that this is a extremely densely populated coastal enclave under blockade. It's 25 by 5 miles, 25 miles long and 5 miles wide. So when as we can see now, since the 7th and since Israel launched its massive bombing campaign and now its ground operations, they're carrying out strikes. We told them to evacuate the north, as they'll say, but they're bombing North Gaza. They're bombing Central Gaza. They're bombing Southern Gaza. The Palestinians have nowhere to go within the open air prison. And so it's important to note that these people have been subjected to massive bombing campaigns like this repeatedly since the siege was imposed. And so this has really created a absolute pressure cooker situation. And for instance, we talk about before we get into Likud's cynical approach to Hamas and why they thought this situation would always work in their favor. We should note that the Palestinians launched a series of weekly protests near their border fence known as the Great March of Return when they were calling for an end to the siege. Because Israel, of course, severely limits their food, keeping them just above a starvation level. Israeli officials have described it as keeping them on keeping the Palestinians on a diet. Most of their water is not potable; it's poison. They control their electricity, which is in and out. I mean, only a few hours per day, and you can't really count on when. And their fuel is restricted, of course, by the Israeli military. Nothing gets into Gaza without the Israeli military's permission. And so the Palestinians launched the Great March of Return in 2018, where they were going up to the going up to the so-called border fence, protesting the occupation and the siege, and calling for their under international law, their right to return to their ancestral lands, which were seized by Israel during the Nakba. And as this UN casualty report lays out, we had 200, Israeli snipers shot over 200 children, as well as they were shooting other people as well, journalists and medics. We had nearly 200 people killed. So, as the UN report lays out, Palestinians have been holding these Great March of Return demonstrations, calling for their right of return and the ending of the blockade. Thousands participated in the gatherings taking place every Friday. And on special days at 5 locations along the perimeter fence. You had smaller protests that were being held during the week at the beach in various locations near the fence during the night. While the vast majority of protesters acted in a peaceful manner, during the protests, dozens approached the fence attempting to damage it, burning tires, throwing stones. And the Israeli military responded by shooting tear gas cannons. Some of them dropped from drones, rubber bullets, and live ammunition, mostly by snipers. As a result, 214 Palestinians, including 46 children, were killed, and over 36,100, including nearly 8,800 children, were injured. So, in 1 in 5 of those injured, and this is over 8,000 Palestinians, were hit by live ammunition. And in this whole series of shootings and targeted killings, 1 Israeli soldier was killed and about 7 others were injured during these demonstrations, which were carried out in 2018 and 2019. And so I think it's very important to keep all of that in mind. In 2021, when Hamas responded by firing rockets into Israel after Israeli settlers carried out pogroms and security forces were launching attacks on Palestinians, and not only in Israel proper, but carrying out an ethnic cleansing campaign in East Jerusalem, evicting people from the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. There was repeated desecration of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, as I mentioned earlier. So Hamas responded by firing some rockets into Israel, which killed nobody. But Netanyahu's government responded with yet another mass murder spree, bombing Gaza and killing, as I said, 250 people, 67 children. In this operation, Guardian of the Walls, as they called it, 17,000 homes were demolished, leaving tens of thousands of Palestinians internally displaced, hitting water supplies, refugee camps, apartment buildings, schools, Gaza's only COVID-19 test center at the time, a Doctors Without Borders clinic, and towers, residential towers, and towers housing media offices as well. In one instance, Israel dropped a smart bomb on a building that contained offices used by the Associated Press, Middle East Eye, and Al Jazeera. Newsweek reported at the time that the targeting and destruction of the Al Jala Tower has been condemned by a number of local and foreign media groups, including 2 of its occupants. The AP and Al Jazeera, which launched its own investigation identifying the weapon that wrecked its offices, was a GBU-31, one of several JDAM variants known to have been exported by the U.S. to Israel in the past years. And of course, America's reward to Israel for that massacre was another $1 billion in military aid to replenish its Iron Dome air defense missile defense system, so that they could continue to, murder all these Palestinians with impunity, and intercept all the rockets that were coming in retaliation from Hamas. And so So as this is all happening, there's this policy of ensuring that Hamas is continually funded by Qatar and Egypt and other states, but particularly Qatar and Egypt, so that they can maintain their control over Gaza and so that Netanyahu and his faction can continue to tell, especially America, but the West, that look, we have nobody to negotiate with. We'd love to negotiate a Palestinian state. Unfortunately, we just can't. And it's so this has been documented by Meron Rapport, the Israeli journalist, as I mentioned earlier, historian Adam Raz, and others. And so the point here is that this is exactly what Likud intended, keeping Gaza under the control of Hamas and a divided and conquered Palestine. So we have all these quotes here in my article with Scott, starting with Likud spokesman Jonathan Urich, who is one of Netanyahu's media advisors, bragging that one of Netanyahu's key successes was disconnecting Gaza from the West Bank conceptually and politically. He says Netanyahu basically smashed the vision of the Palestinian state in these two places. Some of the achievement is related to the Qatari money reaching Hamas each month. Netanyahu had previously begged high officials such as Mossad chief Yossi Cohen and the former leader of Southern Command, Herzi Halevi, who I believe now is the IDF chief of staff. Netanyahu actually sent his men to Doha to beg, that's Avigdor Lieberman, the former defense minister's words, beg the Qataris to keep funneling money into Hamas because Egypt and Qatar were getting fed up with Hamas and their policies, and they were going to stop doing it. And so Netanyahu went over there and had his own chief of the Mossad beg Qatar to continue pouring in money. And between 2012 and 2018, Qatar provided Hamas with over $1 billion. Now, a lot of this goes to funding education and healthcare and working to improve some of Gaza's infrastructure, such as it is. But this money is fungible, of course, so it can also go into funding Hamas's military operations, as well as even right-wing critics of Netanyahu will point out. And so at times, the money would enter the Strip in suitcases full of millions of dollars at a time. So we quote from Haaretz, Amos Harel writes in November of 2018, the criticism suffered by Netanyahu over the weekend was earned fair and square. The photos of $15 million in cash from Qatar entering the Gaza Strip in suitcases casts a ridiculous light on his repeated claims of being tough on Hamas. In reality, Netanyahu is conducting indirect negotiations with Hamas, though he and his government religiously refuse to confirm this. The Qatari cash, which will help preserve Hamas's hold on Gaza, could not have entered without his approval. So all that money is going into Gaza with Tel Aviv's green light, among other things. As I said, they're providing money for fuel and also to pay government salaries. But this is continuing to, maintain Hamas's hold on power there in Gaza. And so we have a former minister of operation and a current Likudnik member of the Israeli Knesset, that's their parliament, defended the policy this way. He says, mark my words, Netanyahu keeps Hamas on its feet so that the entire state of Israel won't become the Gaza envelope. If Hamas collapses, Abbas, he's the president of the Palestinian Authority, he's liable to control Gaza. If he will control it, then voices from the left will arise advocating negotiations and a diplomatic settlement and a Palestinian state in Judea and Sumeria, which is what these settlers and Likudnik Israelis call the West Bank. They want all of that land, of course. That is the policy, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing well over 1,000 people now, as we discussed on our previous show, have been displaced amid rampant settler attacks and attacks by Israeli forces, home demolitions and vandalism of property going on in the West Bank, concurrent with this war on Gaza. We've seen entire communities and villages depopulated. Either people are killed or they're just pushed out of their villages that they've lived in all their lives because the settlers are it's open season now on Palestinians. And so later, this same member of the Knesset reiterated her point, saying if Hamas crumbles, Abbas may rule Gaza. If he rules it, Then voices on the left will encourage a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria. This is the real reason Netanyahu doesn't annihilate Hamas. Everything else is bullshit, she says. Now, Gershon Hacohen, who's a major general in the reserves as well as an associate of Netanyahu, says, quote, "We need to tell the truth. Netanyahu's strategy is to prevent the option of two states. So he is turning Hamas into his closest partner. Openly, Hamas is an enemy. Covertly, it's an ally." The same Hacohen elaborates further on the strategy, stressing that instead of taking out Hamas, Netanyahu prevented Abbas's plot to establish a united Palestinian state. We need to take advantage of the situation of separation between Gaza and Ramallah, where the PA is based. This is a top Israeli interest, and it is impossible to understand the campaign in Gaza without understanding the context. And this is the same Hacohen who oversaw the so-called disengagement policy in 2005. So, in that same year, this is about 2019, we have former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, Netanyahu's own former defense minister, presciently warning that Likud strategy could blow back onto Israeli citizens, particularly those living near the besieged Gaza Strip. He says Netanyahu's strategy is to keep Hamas alive and kicking, even at the price of abandoning the citizens of the South, in order to weaken the PA in Ramallah. So Barak confirms that Netanyahu's goal was keeping the South, quote, on a constant low flame. The purpose was to support Hamas, to weaken the PA, and avoid any sincere negotiations toward a Palestinian state. He says, quote, "It's easier with Hamas to explain to Israelis that there is no one to sit with and no one to talk to. If the PA strengthens, then there will be someone to talk to." And this is a former Israeli prime minister, a former Israeli defense minister. So also using analogy about playing with fire, we have Netanyahu himself boasting to members of his party in the Knesset, the Likud, that he could reliably control the backdraft created by his strategy. He says anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank. It's impossible to reach an agreement with them. Everyone knows this, but we control the height of the flames. Now, Bezalel Smotrich, who's the leader of Israel's religious Zionist party, who's currently the finance minister, as well, we've talked as well. He's, these are the radical Zionist settlers who are hell bent on annexing the whole West Bank, really as Likud has been, just more extreme in their current iteration. And he said. He was even more explicit about this. He says, and think about as well the fact that everybody always says, "Are you trying to?" The big Israeli complaint is that people try to delegitimize the state of Israel. But here's Smotrich in his own words: "The PA is a liability, and Hamas is an asset." On the international playing field, in this game of delegitimization, think about it for a second. The PA is a liability and Hamas is an asset. He said this on Israeli television. It's a terrorist organization. Nobody will recognize it. Nobody will give it status at the International Criminal Court, and nobody will let them push resolutions at the UN, causing us to need an American veto. I'm not sure at all, given the current situation, given the current fact that the central playing field we're playing in is international. Abbas is costing us serious PR or political casualties, and Hamas is in such a situation that it would be an asset. I don't think we need to be afraid of Hamas. Now, Likud member of the Knesset, Gailet Distel Atrabian, approvingly wrote as well, quote, "We must say this honestly. Netanyahu wants Hamas on his feet, and he is ready to pay almost any incomprehensible price for this. Half the country is paralyzed. Children and parents are suffering from post-trauma. Homes are blown up. People are killed. A street cat holds a nuclear tiger by the balls." So they're talking about the results of Hamas's rockets going into these areas in the south of Israel during these massive bombing onslaughts that Israel is carrying out. And of course, this is a reference, nuclear tiger by the balls. This is a reference to the fact that Israel has an arsenal of somewhere between 80 and 300 nuclear weapons that they have not publicly admitted to holding in their military arsenal. It actually makes, as we've discussed before, it makes all of America's aid to Israel illegal per U.S. foreign assistance laws, amendments made to U.S. foreign assistance laws in the 1970s. And but this is what they're saying, that Hamas is holding this nuclear tiger by the balls. And so Erez Tadmor, another Likud campaign advisor, wrote in support of the prime minister's policy that the preferred strategic reality for Israel is to maintain the split between Fatah and Hamas. The ideological fragmentation is inherent in the nature of the organizations. The geographic split is a consequence of PA rule in the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas coup in Gaza. This split between Abbas's Palestinian Authority and Hamas's Gaza is optimal for Israel. This way, we can hit Hamas in Gaza, and we are not required to retreat to the lines of Auschwitz due to the danger of a Hamas coup in the West Bank. There is a reality that is even better than just a geographical split between the West Bank, Fatah, and Gaza with Hamas. The situation where Fatah controls the West Bank from a position of weakness, in which its dependence on Israel is increasing, and Hamas controls Gaza from a position of weakness, and its ability to harm Israel is limited. This is exactly the situation we are in strategically in the Palestinian arena. The Palestinians are divided and weakened. Fatah is weak in the West. Hamas is weak in Gaza. Do you want better than this? Move to Tuscany. You will have a few years of peace until the barbarians arrive there too. The only thing that the brawlers who want to run and conquer Gaza at the cost of hundreds of deaths would have achieved if they had managed to impose their position was the worsening of Israel's strategic situation and not its improvement. You don't even understand what the Machiavellian Netanyahu achieved. An arrangement was made with Qatar, which began sending hundreds of millions of dollars to the Hamas leadership with Israeli approval. The insider told me that, quote, Bibi was convinced that he would have more control over Hamas with the Qatari money, let them occasionally fire rockets into southern Israel and have access to jobs inside Israel, than he would with the Palestinian Authority. He took that risk. And of course, this cavalier attitude of assuming that there was really no threat. This was shared by military commanders in Israel's army who were supposed to be guarding near, monitoring the security situation on the so-called border with Gaza. As the Jerusalem Post reported, questions remain about how Israel failed to thwart Hamas's assault on the 7th. IDF lookouts told N12 on Monday, as an Israeli outlet, that they had repeatedly warned their commanders of unusual incidents along the border, but they were ignored. One lookout told the outlet that a day before everything happened, I saw people with maps. They were looking at the fence and pointing at it. I told everyone, listen, something is going to happen. I see them planning things. I noticed that something was different on the front. I even told the person next to me in jest, listen, they're going to storm our post. It just looks different. The lookout added that despite her warnings, her commanders, quote, discounted her concerns, telling her Hamas is just a bunch of punks. They won't do anything. And so as Hamas, as these wars with Hamas are ongoing, during the beginning in the Trump years, the Netanyahu doctrine, which basically is where they're going to work with they're going to back Hamas to prevent any negotiations over a Palestinian state. And as we're seeing here from all these Likud hawks, they're so proud of the policy, they think it's so brilliant. They're going to have a weak PA that has no power and really is almost completely deferential to Israel and really provides no resistance or accountability to the Palestinian people whatsoever. And then in Gaza, you have Hamas, this Islamist faction running it, who commits human rights abuses against their own people, and how they provide social services. And quite frankly, especially in the last few years, whether people like it or not, it's just a fact that Hamas really is the vanguard of the armed resistance of the Palestinian people suffering under this brutal military occupation for 56 years. And that's why, as we saw in 2021, this policy of dividing the Palestinians would no longer work, because Hamas was responding with their rockets to evictions going on in Jerusalem against Palestinians living in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, and the desecration and the attacks on Palestinians, the vicious beatings of men, women, children, the elderly at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And, of course, the West Bank, there's a rigid gun control imposed by the Israeli occupation forces. And the people there live under just a humiliating occupation every day of their lives, subjected to home demolitions and settler attacks and, just imprisonment without charges, so-called administrative detention, children and being thrown even as young as 5 years old, being thrown into prison and forced to sign confessions in Hebrew that they can't possibly understand and possibly implicate their families. There's a great piece about this by Matthew Ho, the Afghan war whistleblower, the great Matthew Ho at antiwar.com today, that people should read. But this policy was going to continue. The settlers were going to continue to have. They were going to flood into the West Bank and continue colonizing the Palestinians' land, with being protected by the IDF so that they can kill Palestinians whenever they want and get away with it as they are now. But at the same time, Donald Trump and Jared Kushner and Benjamin Netanyahu, and since then the Joe Biden administration, as we've been covering here for the last few years, have been implementing this policy where they thought if they would make deals by basically providing all these Gulf dictatorships the U.S. has backed for decades, like Bahrain or the UAE, or they tried with Saudi Arabia, that they could basically buy them off. Because for the longest time, these Arab monarchies and Sunni states would refuse to recognize Israel unless the Palestinians were given their own state or given equal rights. Under the Arab Peace Plan sort of framework. And basically, it's called the Abraham Accords, which are a thinly veiled, NATO-style military coalition that's eyeing Iran. That was always the plan. The Israelis have been explicit about that. Benny Gantz, for instance, the former defense minister, he now holds a position in the newly formed war cabinet with Netanyahu. They set about brokering these phony peace deals, particularly beginning with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, where the UAE gets F-35, or they were supposed to get F-35s. That's another story, because a big part of this is where the U.S. is also trying to curtail China's influence in the region and get them to kick out Huawei and Chinese tech giants and do business with American firms. And because UAE didn't want to go along with that, they ultimately didn't get their F-35s. But the U.S. in this deal, we're going to provide them with F-35s and Reaper drones and I believe well over 10,000 munitions as well. Bahrain was going to get their F-16s. They've also made deals with Morocco, for instance, where they recognized, the U.S. recognized another shame on America's legacy. We've recognized their sovereignty over Western Sahara, where they're carrying out a brutal occupation of their own against the people there. And also they've made deals with Sudan as well and taken them off the state sponsors of terror list, and rolling over some of their debts onto the American taxpayer. And we've seen just it's basically, this is the idea, is to ingratiate Israel into the Arab world, the Muslim world. They were really the prize they were eyeing most was Saudi Arabia. They were working so hard on that deal. And it did look like there was going to be, because Saudi was, I thought that they were holding out, and maybe, because they had made a peace deal brokered with Iran, brokered by China, that they would be more reluctant to make this deal with Israel, considering this is, as I said, really a military coalition that was being built up, eyeing a future war with the Islamic Republic, which would just completely devastate the whole region. But Saudi Arabia was seeking a Article 5 style security guarantee, a NATO style security guarantee, or akin to our mutual defense commitment with the Japanese, as well as assistance in building their nuclear energy program, and also a more advanced American weaponry. And actually, MBS told Fox News himself not long before the October 7th attack that every day we get closer to making this deal with the Israelis. So it was right out of the horse's mouth. But at the same time, they kept building up pressure in this pressure cooker, so to speak. Is Israel, this was one of the deadliest years before October for Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. More than 220 Palestinians had been killed by Israeli forces and settlers before October. That includes, I believe, 187 people in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. There was a smaller bombing campaign in Gaza in May, which killed, I believe, more than roughly 36 people. You had, of course, Israel was carrying out a very destabilizing foreign policy, apart from even just what they were doing to the Palestinians. Netanyahu had doubled his airstrikes, at least in Syria, and that was boasted about by his defense minister Yoav Gallant, the same man who's overseeing this current bombing campaign and ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza that's approaching a genocide at this point, who called the Palestinians in Gaza human animals and said we're cutting off all their water, their fuel, their electricity, and their medicine. He had boasted that we're bombing Syria twice as much as the previous administrations have, and before then, Israel bombs Syria almost every week. It's pretty. It's just absolutely illegal and incredibly destabilizing. They recently just bombed the Damascus airport. Kyle talked about that on the show today, knocking it out of service. They had just gotten it back up and running again after the last time it was bombed. And so, Israel had also, as I said, launched drone strikes in Iran. They had bombed Lebanon this year during the bombing campaign against Gaza in May. And so the head of the Mossad, David Barnea, was just bragging and declaring that we're going to launch an assassination campaign in the heart of Tehran in Iran back in September. And so the Israelis had been, out of control. I mean, in fact, the Abraham Accords were becoming less and less popular. There was a great piece in Bloomberg earlier this year about how Israel's massacres of the Palestinians in the West Bank this year, since Netanyahu's coalition with these extremist settler factions like Religious Zionism and Jewish Power, the party led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the Minister of National Security under Netanyahu, they had carried out horrible massacres, like in the Jenin refugee camp, multiple times before October. One of the worst ones was in July, where they sent 1,000 troops and 150 armored vehicles and drones and Apache helicopters and bulldozers to tear up their water and electricity networks and their roads, and they killed 12 people, including some children. In fact, I think the death toll actually went up after that, that it might have been like 18 even people that were killed. But it's been absolutely horrendous. And so this policy, the Netanyahu doctrine, the utter failure of it is seen in this October 7th attack, because I want to make clear that the problem here is not just that Netanyahu was cynically supporting Hamas so that he could steal the West Bank. And now, as we can see, they're just going to go ahead and steal Gaza if they can make it unlivable enough, or just bomb so many people and push them into the Sinai Peninsula or Turkey or whatever neighboring countries. They're demanding that the West take in all these refugees and help participate in Israel's ethnic cleansing so they can take all of the Gaza Strip. This was not going to work, because they thought that they could basically get these Arab states to throw the Palestinians under the bus and they would recognize Israel, and this issue would no longer be on the table. That's what Mike Pompeo believed. That's what Donald Trump believed. That's what Joe Biden and Antony Blinken believed. And now, of course, we're on the precipice of a massive regional war that will make, if it really heats up here and the United States gets into a fight with the axis of resistance, the Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq, where the U.S. is still illegally occupying territory, including a third of Syria. The Houthis have already declared war on Israel until they implement a lasting ceasefire. Firing rockets and drones toward Israel and seizing Israeli-linked ships. We have Hezbollah, of course, at the northern border. That could pop off at any time. As Kyle described it recently, it's currently it was at probably about a level 3. We're getting closer to a 5, and so that could heat up any moment. We have fighters being killed every week on both sides. And civilians as well, and journalists over there in the crossfire between Hezbollah and the Israelis. Israel has killed. I mean, the estimates are now. We haven't seen an official estimate from the Gaza Health Ministry since November 10th. But at that point, the last one was over 11,000 people have been killed. The vast majority of them are civilians. It's not even close. We know from reporting, I believe in the Times, that from Pentagon officials, that the Israel has not even begun to inflict any significant damage on Hamas's middle leadership ranks, let alone its top tier leadership ranks, even of the military faction of Hamas, not the political wing. And so, this is just absolutely a horrible situation that we're in, and it's really a result of both, the Americans and Benjamin Netanyahu and his compatriots believing that they could erase the Palestinians off the map, circumvent them, and ignore them, and get these other Arab states to do the same. Um, but as we've seen with these bombing campaigns, Israel could not continue to subject these people to this just absolute hell. And get away with it. And so, unfortunately, civilians were killed in Israel, and unfortunately, many, many more civilians are being killed in Gaza now. And it has to stop. And so, the only way that the Israelis can really make peace would be to either end the siege, end the occupation, and to allow the Palestinians to have self-determination or provide them with equal rights as any other citizens, Jewish or otherwise. And it's important to note that the attacks on Christians escalated significantly this year under Netanyahu. The Palestinians are made up of Muslims and Christians. And so all these people of all three Abrahamic religions deserve to have equal rights in the Holy Land there between the river and the sea. But as Netanyahu declared in 2020, Israel retains security control from the entire region from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. So when people say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that's a call for genocide. They're not being honest. But what Netanyahu is saying is that Palestine will never be free from the river to the sea, that Israel, there will be one government, one security force in control of that entire territory. And that's just unsustainable. And of course, it provokes so much hatred toward Americans and terrorism against the United States and our armed forces who are in that region illegally and where they shouldn't be. But nevertheless, this is just an absolute powder keg, and America's relationship with Israel is just indefensible at this point.
All right, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. I know you got a little bit more in that article even than what you were able to cover on today's show. But like I said, I think that's a good point. It really gets our audience almost up to October 7th, where I'm sure most of the people who are listening to this show today have listened to us talk about the situation in Israel since. If you're a new listener, just tune in and subscribe, because we talk about it on almost every episode right now, the situation in Israel, and constantly giving updates. So Connor, thank you so much for this. Everybody, if you haven't already, head on over to the libertarianinstitute.org and donate if you can. We have great kit bags, so you probably get yourself one of, I think Sheldon's books are available. You could get yourself a copy of Coming to Palestine and really get a good background on all this stuff. Sheldon's done so much work. Sheldon Richmond, that is, on this issue, so that we have that book published at the Institute. Connor, thank you. We'll do it again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.